pegar meu texto aqui. Vamos começar, então? Tá. Okay. Bom dia a todos, todas e todes. É um grande prazer. Estamos aqui para mais um evento do Grupo de Estudos em Política e Subjetividades. Mais perto? Eu queria dar boas-vindas a vocês que vieram até aqui, ouvir a Lisa Guenther, conhecer um pouco desse trabalho sobre fenomenologia crítica, e as pessoas que estão assistindo pelo YouTube e vão assistir depois. Esse é um evento, como eu estava dizendo, organizado pelo Grupo de Estudos de Política e Subjetividades, que eu coordeno aqui na USP, e eu queria agradecer muito, primeiro em português, a todos os estudantes que se envolveram, não só na recepção da Lisa Guenther, mas na tradução do texto para o português, para que a gente pudesse passá-lo aqui, compartilhá-lo e estudá-lo antes de falar com a Lisa. Eu vou fazer uma pequena apresentação, só para a gente introduzir o assunto que vamos tratar hoje. Depois eu vou passar a palavra para a Mariana Piazzolla. E, por fim, teremos a fala da Lisa e depois abriremos para as perguntas. Então, good morning. It is with pleasure and joy that I begin our activities today. Lisa Guenther is traveling through Latin America, including I stay in São Paulo. This is a great opportunity for us, students and researchers of phenomenology and Merleau-Ponty's thought, to learn more about her ideas. We thank you for sharing your vision for critical phenomenology with us. Today's event was organized by the Politics and Subjectivities Study Group, which I coordinate here in Philosophy Department. This is a very special moment for critical phenomenology studies among us, as next week we will have Emmanuel de Saint-Aubert and Benedetta Zaccarello, both Merleau-Ponty researchers, at the colloquium Contemporary Philosophy and its Archives, Chiasms between Brazil and France, also coordinated by me. I'd like to invite you to this colloquium as well, which will take place next week in room 8. I'd like to thank my students who dedicated themselves to studying and translating Lisa Guenther's paper. And I'd like to invite Mariana Piazzolla to speak, as she has been a tremendous help in organizing our international activities. Thank you again, Lisa Guenther, and have a great conference.
So, good morning. Welcome, everyone, to this conference. So I'd like to say that I'm very pleased to organize this event with Professor Guenther this week, whom I would like to thank you for her availability and whose work I've got in contact, because I think we share an interest common in exploring feminist readings in Levinas, is one of them. And I'd like to thank Professor Silvana Ramos for inviting me to organize with her this event. And we had the workshop took place on Tuesday, and it was incredible. We've learned a lot, and I'm pretty sure that today the debate it will be so amazing, that the last one, I think, because the debate is resonate until now. And now we have this opportunity to listen to her in a lecture whose title is she makes a reference to Beauvoir's famous quote, "No one is not born, but rather becomes woman." And now today's title is "No one is not born, but rather becomes normal," towards a critical phenomenology of Lifeworld. And we tried to translate using the same structure in Portuguese, não se nasce normal, torna-se normal. I say we because Silvana said that our study group, we've been involved in a collective translation. that I will project during her lecture. And I need to thank Vitor Frolich, César Prado, Luísa Garcia, Rafaela Oliveira, Diogo Oliveira, Simone Campelo, e Ricardo Polidoro. Thank you very much for the effort. I'd like to thank our department and the Conf working group, because we are a member of the working group Race, Gender, and Class. It is a support for us too. Our study group, of course, the staff, FFLS staff, for providing this broadcast event. And I think it is. So I will read the biography, mini biography. And then we can start, because we are gathering today for this. In English. Lisa Guenther is Queen's National Scholar in Political Philosophy and Critical Prison Studies at Queen's University in Canada. She is the author of Solitary Confinement, Social Death and Its Afterlives, and The Gift of the Other, Levinas and the Politics of Reproduction, as well as co-editor of Death and Other Penalties, Philosophy in a Time of Mass Incarceration. For 2012 and 2017, she facilitated a discussion group with men on death row in Tennessee called REACH Coalition, and she's currently a member of P4W Memorial Collective Advisory Board. Guenther teaches philosophy classes at Collins Bay Prison through the Walls to Bridge program. She's working on a book entitled No Prisons on Stolen Land, a critical phenomenology of the carceral colonial Lifeworld. So, Lisa, Professor Guenther, now the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mariana, for that lovely introduction. And thank you to Silvana for organizing this event and the workshop. It's a real pleasure to be here in Sao Paulo with you. And thank you for coming this afternoon or this morning. As I was walking around campus and going through the buildings, I see many signs of the crisis that we're living through right now. Graffiti that says, "Fascists get out." Graffiti that is fighting for justice in Palestine. Graffiti that is asserting reproductive rights and gender diversity, sexual diversity. And so many of the gains that we have made as feminists, as decolonial thinkers and activists, as people fighting for a more just world, are being pushed back today, all over the world. And it was a great pleasure to be here in Brazil when at least one fascist was held accountable. that was a wonderful moment. But in the midst of this life world in crisis, we sometimes feel the gap between the philosophical work that we're doing that requires such careful attention and in some ways is so solitary. And we have to shut out so many aspects of the world to understand, what is Merleau-Ponty saying? What does he mean? What is the significance of this? What is Husserl saying? That sometimes that gap between our philosophical research and what we care about in the world feels immense. And so I wrote this paper standing in that gap. And I will be honest, when I first started working through Husserl's manuscripts on intersubjectivity, I did not think that I would find inspiration for addressing the current moment in those manuscripts. On the surface of things, it felt like Husserl was making an argument for normality. Everyone must be normal. We have to follow our traditions. It felt like a very conservative text. But as I read more closely, and as I started to live with these words and ideas, I saw so much more complexity opening up. And so I want to share that reading with you and see if you also find inspiration in Husserl's work written in his own life world in crisis for working through the situation we find ourselves in today. So now I will start reading the text that Mariana and her colleagues have very kindly and generously translated. A father of 3 is mistakenly deported and sent to a notorious overseas prison. A PhD student is suddenly arrested and threatened with deportation for having participated in public protests. A trans person tries to renew their passport and is told their gender marker is no longer valid. Ordinary people in a democratic state are being snatched from their homes and communities, abducted by police or border guards, confined in prisons and immigration detention centers, or told their gender does not exist. Their everyday lives have been upended, and our shared life world is being rattled to the core. Who's next? Is anyone safe? What does safety even mean anymore? A changing world changes those who inhabit it. We do not remain the same when the established order of our world, however imperfect, is radically disrupted. We lose our bearings, our anchorage in the familiar. We might lash out in anger, or hide under the covers, or stare into space when we are supposed to be writing a lecture. We become a question to ourselves, and the context for responding to this question no longer seems reliable. Husserl's Phenomenology of the Life World gives us a framework for engaging with this crisis philosophically. In his writings from the 1920s and 1930s, a time of conflict, instability, and rising authoritarianism in Weimar Germany, Husserl affirms the importance of engaging critically with the historical past to revitalize and transform its meaning. As, quote, the universal field of all actual and possible praxis, end quote, the life world is not merely the setting or locus of human activity, but a horizon that shapes the appearance of objects and other subjects within the world. This horizon is, quote, always already there, existing in advance for us, end quote, as a context of norms, habits, traditions, and other structures that embed our lived experience at any given moment within a longer history of intergenerational time. As such, the life world is not an object that we experience directly. It is the ground in relation to which both subjects and objects emerge. As soon as we try to grasp the horizon itself, it slips away. It is the framework of sense that, precisely in being always already there, evades any attempt to pin it down. This concept of the life world offers phenomenologists a rich vocabulary for critically engaging with what I have elsewhere called quasi-transcendental structures, namely historically sedimented patterns like patriarchy, capitalism, racism, and colonialism, all of which have been recoded as DEI, or diversity, equity, inclusion, by the Trump administration. The emergence of these structures is contingent in the sense that they could have unfolded otherwise, or not at all. But once established, they actively shape the lived experience of those who inhabit the life world in which they are operative. While Husserl does not explicitly theorize social structures like patriarchy, his reflections on the life world in the 1930s have inspired generations of phenomenologists to undertake such analyses. Husserl proposes what he calls a regressive analysis of the life world, beginning with a concrete situation and following leading threads from the natural and social sciences back to the structures of the life world that make this situation possible and meaningful. Rather than beginning merely with lived experience in the first person singular, a phenomenology of the life world begins with social praxis in a concrete historical situation. Quote, questioning back systematically precisely to those presuppositions that formed the concealed basis of their cognitive accomplishments, end quote. That was from Anthony Steinbach. This regressive method of questioning back unfolds not in a linear step-by-step sequence, but through zigzags in a jagged way, that trace and retrace the contingent processes that have sedimented over time to form the crust of the world as we know it here and now. 100 years later, this critical method offers phenomenologists a powerful way to make sense of our own unfolding crisis, in which authoritarian movements across the globe are attacking both marginalized communities and powerful institutions, including universities, museums, law firms, news organizations, and even their own government agencies. Husserl understood that a life world needs stability in order to sustain itself and to support those who inhabit it. A world in which people can be disappeared from one day to the next is a world in crisis, a world at risk of collapse. But he also recognizes that a life world needs a plurality of different ways of being. It needs diversity in order to renew itself and reflect those who inhabit it. A world in which one group of people dictates the reality to which everyone else must conform or be punished is a world in crisis, a world at risk of collapse. The capacity to renew the life world, which Husserl addressed in his Kaiso articles, is not simply the determination to keep old structures alive by repeating them. A living world must remain open to the transformation of established norms. At the same time, the world risks becoming unlivable when shared norms, such as the norms of behavior for political leadership or international diplomacy, are disrespected. Stability and diversity are fundamental structures of the life world, which are often in tension with one another, but for this very reason must be kept in balance. While Husserl's own emphasis is on the stability of the life world, in my lecture today, I will draw on some passages from his manuscripts on intersubjectivity from the early 1930s to argue that he was also alive to the importance of diversity, both at a cultural level, through the irreducible relationship between homeworld and alien world, and at an individual level through the event of birth and the anomalous status of the child. So I'm using the word diversity here not because it is a key term for Husserl, it's not, but because it has come under attack in our current life world. This attention to difference helps us to understand that even or especially in a crisis, there is no meaningful stability without diversity. Attacks on diversity are attacks on the structure of the life world as such, whose capacity for renewal, I will argue, depends on the emergence of anomalies in the midst of normal life. So the first section is called Homeworld and Alien World. For Husserl, the term homeworld or Heimwelt refers to the finite life world into which one was born, and alien world or Fremdwelt refers to the strange or unfamiliar life worlds in relation to which one's own homeworld unfolds. As correlative terms, homeworld and alien world entail one another. No single homeworld can claim to encompass the world as a whole. The finitude of each specific life world is realized through an acknowledgement that what is familiar for us is strange for others, and vice versa. The strangeness of the alien world need not imply a value judgment. It is simply unfamiliar to those who do not dwell within it, and one's own familiar self-understanding emerges in contrast with this otherness. Even so, Bernard Waldenfels notes a tension within Husserl's account of the life world. On one hand, he says, quote, "The homeworld is presupposed as a center and ground from which the worlds of others are accessible, in which case we are already on the verge of appropriation of alien worlds, be it the hard way of conquest, the soft way of comprehension, or both ways at once. The otherness of the other and the alienness of the alien world get grinded between the millstones of what is one's own and what is common," end quote. This is what I will call the expansionist tendency in Husserl's account of the life world, and it is what critics object to as a Eurocentric account of the common world, understood as a universalized projection of Europe's higher culture. There are plenty of examples of this expansionist tendency in Husserl's work. Consider, for example, this passage from his 1935 Vienna lecture. Quote, "There is something unique here in European culture that is recognized in us by all other human groups, something that, quite apart from all considerations of utility, becomes a motive for them to Europeanize themselves, even in their unbroken will to spiritual self-preservation, whereas we, if we understand ourselves properly, would never Indianize ourselves, for example," end quote. Here and elsewhere, Husserl posits Europe as an eternal pole for the teleological development of humanity. While one could contextualize this Eurocentrism in various ways, I think it's better to acknowledge this tendency as a genuine problem, but one which can be mitigated by emphasizing other tendencies in Husserl's work, or less mitigated, more critiqued. There are resources within Husserl to critique his own Eurocentrism. While on one hand, a universalized sense of the world unfolds through an expansion of my own homeworld, on the other hand, as Waldenfels notes, quote, "Homeworld and alien world are co-primordial in the sense that the familiarity of one only shows up as such in contrast to the unfamiliarity of the other. In this sense, homeworld and alien world, familiar and strange, are co-constitutive structures of worldhood. Neither is meaningful without the other, and the world does not exist without both." This insight highlights a relational tendency in Husserl's account of the life world, which some scholars have elaborated as grounds for an intercultural, multicultural, or cosmopolitan reading of his work. From this perspective, the universalization of any culture, European or otherwise, would threaten the relational structure of the life world. Anthony Steinbach emphatically rejects such a project. He says, quote, "By making a so-called ethical one world, we would not be renewing generativity, but negating it, actually making our world unethical, and risking a destruction of the entire structure, homeworld, alien world." End quote. This relational tendency offers an important rejoinder to the problem of Eurocentrism, or US imperialism for that matter. But I fear that without a further analysis of normalizing power both within and between life worlds, it risks slipping back into what Waldenfels calls the soft way of comprehension. A homeworld becomes familiar to those who inhabit it through the sharing of norms, habits, and traditions that are passed down from generation to generation. But for Husserl, not everyone who inhabits a homeworld is included among those who co-constitute its sense. Only, in his view, normal, mature persons have the social epistemic authority to engage in this process. He has a list of those who do not. Children, madmen, Dummköpfe, Idioten, primitive people, and animals are excluded from full participation in this collective intentionality as co-creators of meaning. Husserl acknowledges that these anomalous subjects do belong to the homeworld in which they find themselves. They may even co-constitute certain finite spheres of normality with others who share their particular anomaly. But given the anomalous character of their experience in contrast with ours, the world does not belong to them as proper subjects. They are included as members of the homeworld, but excluded as co-constitutors of its meaning. The result is, in my view, an overly homogeneous account of the homeworld as the habitual domain of normal subjects, without an explicit reflection on the power relations that generate the criteria by which normal and anomalous subjects are distinguished. And that's not just an ethical and political problem, it's a philosophical problem as well. There's a gap in the account of how one is constituted as normal such that one can co-constitute the meaning of the life world within which one functions as normal. Consider this issue in light of ongoing authoritarian attacks on human diversity. US Vice President J.D. Vance has justified the mass deportation of undocumented immigrants on the basis of a very narrow constriction of the homeworld and a distortion of the Catholic doctrine of ordo amoris. He says, quote, There is a Christian concept that you love your family, and then you love your neighbor, and then you love your community, and then you love your fellow citizens in your own country. And then after that, you can focus and prioritize the rest of the world. The repetition of love in this statement should not distract us from the hierarchy it implies between those who are more familiar and therefore more eligible for care, and those who are more alien and therefore more vulnerable to exclusion. When such a view is adopted by authoritarian leaders who assume the power to deport, defund, and make deals based on thinly veiled threats, the stability promised by the social reproduction of norms evaporates pretty quickly. To be clear, Husserl does not share Vance's view of love, and he would no doubt reject his politics. But in light of the expansionist tendency in Husserl's writing about the life world, we need to balance his understandable emphasis on the stability of the home world with his more nuanced appreciation for the diversity of its inhabitants. Without this diversity, the renewal of the life world risks collapsing into an overly narrow reinforcement of existing norms, and even worse, an imperialist expansion of those norms. To be sure, Husserl understands renewal in terms of an ethical turn towards a universal ethical human culture. But I will argue that he also gives us language for interpreting renewal in less universalist, expansionist ways. In the next section of this paper, I will draw on Husserl's intersubjectivity manuscripts from the early 1930s to argue that birth, or what Hannah Arendt would later call natality, is both a transcendental structure of the life world and a generative source of anomaly upon which the life world depends for its diversity and its capacity for renewal. And we can't have one without the other. We can't have the generativity without the anomaly. These insights suggest a third generative tendency in Husserl's phenomenology of the life world, beyond the expansionist and relational tendencies I have briefly sketched. The anomalous status of children in particular suggests that, for Husserl, one is not born, but rather becomes normal to various degrees and through various mechanisms, many of which establish stability on the basis of coercion and even domination. But the sheer fact that each and every one of us started out as an anomalous child, that no one can be born normal because the standards of normality are established through historical institution in a world that is already underway by the time this anomalous newborn child arrives. This suggests that anomaly, as an intrinsic feature of birth, is a transcendental structure of the life world. There is no life world without both the anomalous upsurge of singular, unforeseen persons who are born into a history that is stabilized through norms, traditions, and durable structures that will gradually become familiar to the newborn, but which remain open to transformation thanks to the diversity, or what Arendt calls the plurality, of natal subjects, subjects who are born. The generative tension between normalcy and anomaly forms the basic structure of the life world. And this is a good thing, because it suggests that however unavoidable the coercive power of normalization may be, bless you, the collective co-constitution of the life world remains open to creative elaboration and social transformation. To me, this suggests that no amount of authoritarian control can suppress the spontaneous upsurge of anomalous life in the midst of the normal, for the anomaly of birth is not an empirical glitch, but a transcendental structure of the life world. In what remains of my time today, I will explore the phenomenology of birth, first with an emphasis on normalization, and then with an emphasis on its anomalous character. So the next section is called Normalizing Birth. In a series of reflections from the early 1930s, Husserl gestures towards birth and death as problems for transcendental phenomenology. He argues that, quote, birth and death must be considered as constitutive occurrences for the possibility of the constitution of the world, end quote. The generativity of birth and death is not accidental but essential. Quote, It belongs to humans as such to be born and to die. And these limit experiences are linked to the historicity of human existence, or the constitution of the world for me, for us, as a historical Umwelt, or environment, of historical people, historical human communities, end quote. Each and every one of us is born into a world with previously established norms and an ongoing history to which we too will presumably contribute. Husserl writes, quote, "Since I have been in connection with others for a long time, and for as long as I can remember, my actualities and habits, my entire life of interests, and lasting being as an ego of habitual interests, abilities, habits, etc., relate to an environment, an Umwelt, that already contains others and has been formed in interaction with others and is always new," end quote. So this is the insight that one cannot be born without being born to another. This is something we were talking about on Tuesday. As Heidegger, and specifically born to a mother, to a woman. As Heidegger would say, I am thrown into a world of Mitsein, or being with others. And as Merleau-Ponty elaborates through his own inheritance of Husserl's phenomenology, the habits, interests, and abilities of embodied consciousness emerged through a process of being affected by the world into which I was born, taking up certain aspects of this world through my own embodied praxis, and modifying it in various ways, both deliberately and unconsciously, to the point where these actions and reactions sediment into a more or less stable but revisable corporeal style. Husserl follows up his acknowledgement of the world's already there-ness with a reflection on normality. He says, quote, "Every new person who enters my circle is apperceived in my image. And now he is called normal if the general outline of the horizon that he must have for me through the use of perceptual empathy, precisely as my equal, agrees with me in the general style of being, i.e., is concretely similar to myself in the progress of the experience whereby the concretion encompasses the entire style of being in which I have already formed for myself, and the corresponding world that is conscious for me in its correlative style." So basically, someone else shows up as normal to me if they concord with my own established sense of normality. On one hand, I perceive others as normal or not through empathy, on the basis of their similarity to or difference from my own style of being. I take myself as the norm by which their normality will be judged. On the other hand, since, as Husserl acknowledged in the previous passage I shared, I have been in contact with others for as long as I can remember, my own habits, interests, and styles have emerged in relation to these others. I did not invent these norms out of thin air. The social historical world is the source of norms by which I too may be judged as normal or abnormal, depending on the harmonization of my own habits, interests, and styles with world historical patterns that were established before I can remember, indeed before I was born. A gap opens up between these 2 points. How did I become normal such that I am now able to perceive others as normal based on their harmonization with my own general style of being? And what if I am not perceived by others as normal? What happens then to my social epistemic authority to perceive the normal or anomalous status of others? Husserl seems to presume that the reader of his text, and also he himself, are normal subjects. But how do we know this? Except through appeal to established norms in a historical world that we inherited that were already in operation before we were born as anomalous subjects. Simone de Beauvoir grapples with the process of normalization in her landmark book, The Second Sex. For Beauvoir, the norms of feminine existence produce a distorted form of subjectivity that undermines the existential freedom of women and puts men in a structural position of bad faith, parasitic upon the domination of women. As Beauvoir famously writes, quote, "One is not born, but rather becomes a woman. No biological, psychological, or economic destiny defines the figure that the human female acquires in society. It is civilization as a whole that develops this product, intermediate between female and eunuch, which one calls feminine. Only the mediation of another can establish an individual as an other, end quote. And I would add, only the mediation of another can establish an individual as normal. We rely on others for our own normalcy through which we use as a standard to judge the normalcy of others. Reading Beauvoir alongside Husserl, we could modify and expand her claim. It is the life world as a whole that develops subjects of any gender. Only the mediation of another can establish an individual as normal or anomalous in accordance with or resistance to norms and traditions that were established before our birth, but which remain open to transformation. Beauvoir's point is that the social norms of femininity are at odds with a woman's existential freedom, or to translate this into more Husserlian language, the norms of femininity are not optimal for women. They're not the best for a given situation, even if they are concordant with the established traditions of the life world. They adhere to and repeat those established traditions. But since the life world is a generative structure rather than a destiny, and since the stability of the life world is both tempered by diversity and depends upon diversity for its renewal, the possibility remains open for a collective restructuring of the life world. In their reading of this passage in The Second Sex, Judith Butler emphasizes the generative process of becoming at the heart of Beauvoir's existential phenomenology of gender. They write, quote, "Becoming a gender is an impulsive yet mindful process of interpreting a cultural reality laden with sanctions, taboos, and prescriptions. The choice to assume a certain kind of body, to live or wear one's body a certain way, implies a world of already established corporeal styles. To choose a gender is to interpret received gender norms in a way that organizes them anew. Rather than a radical act of creation out of nothing, gender is a tacit project to renew one's cultural history in one's own terms. This is not a prescriptive task we must endeavor to do, but one which we have been endeavoring all along." So here I feel like Butler is very close to what Husserl means by Besinnung, or sense investigation, which is the restoration, reactivation, and reorientation of possibilities within a transcendental field. In other words, even though we are born into a world with established norms that may or may not support our freedom, a creative engagement with these norms is not only possible but inevitable, given the temporal structure of individuated social existence as a process of becoming. When anomalous subjects interpret received norms in a way that organizes them anew, we are engaged in a praxis of renewing our cultural history, our homeworld, on our own terms. So it's not true that the only option for relating to others is to start from the assumption, I'm normal, to judge others whether they are normal or not based on my own normality, presumed, and to continue to repeat those norms. There are other possibilities. Returning to Husserl, I want to suggest that while he places emphasis on the stable reproduction of the life world through the transmission of habits and traditions from generation to generation, there are also openings in his work for an appreciation of how the anomaly of birth makes possible a generative renewal of the life world through a diversity of embodied existential styles. I will now turn to the passages in the intersubjectivity manuscripts where I see this possibility most vividly articulated. So this next section is called Anomalous Birth. As Husserl notes repeatedly in his intersubjectivity manuscripts, no one is born as a mature normal subject. Each and every one of us comes into the world as an anomalous child, and we must learn from others how, and I would add whether, to become normal in the terms of the life world into which we were born. Husserl reflects on what he calls, quote, the chaining and branching of generations in an endlessly open generative context, within which every person, as long as he lives in his world consciousness, Weltbewusstsein, knows himself, namely as a child of his parents, who has become mature as a result of being raised by them and by his fellow subjects who have become mature in their communication, end quote. Husserl connects the intergenerational timeline of birth to the question of memory. Quote, as long as alien memory is in line with my own possible memory, as long as my memory has only the limit of forgetting, as long as my inability to remember is mere forgetfulness, which at the same time leaves open the potentiality of remembering what has been forgotten, a constitution of the world is not satisfied. That would be as if generativity with birth and death were an accidental fact of the world. I find this passage quite extraordinary. Husserl is saying, in effect, that world constitution is not achieved through the seamless coordination of my memory with the memory of others, which would expand my own limited memory through the memory of others. Rather, the constitution of the world is essentially intergenerational, such that the memory of previous generations exceeds my own, not just accidentally, but by virtue of a transcendental structure, a gap between generations, a gap of incomplete remembering and constitutive forgetting or lapses of memory. In other words, the generativity of birth and death is demonstrated and by no means undermined by the fact that I cannot fully recuperate the gap between my memory and the memory of others. I cannot remember their memories. And yet my own lived experience presupposes the historical precedence of others, and my memories intertwine with theirs to various degrees, because I only became normal to the extent that I did in relation to these memories of ancestors passed down to me. Empathy can take me some distance in reanimating the actual and possible memories of others, but it seems important for the generative structure of the world that a memory gap should remain between generations, that the past of the life world into which I was born remain to some degree immemorial and opaque for those who are born into it. Husserl continues, quote, the same applies to the future real and possible entry of others into my sphere of experience. They are others that I will experience or could experience. My human existence among my people is probable, and certain existence together with them as others. But now death and birth enter the experience of this level anew as meaning-making for people and the world. The future certainty of one's own existence as a human being living in the world among people and of the existence of every other person is given as an uncrossable limit. And in a similar way, the certainty of memory of a human past and people in the life of the world. So empathy connects us with others, allowing us to understand and even reanimate their memories to some degree. This is how normalization happens. But birth and death introduce an uncrossable limit to empathy, an uncertainty or opacity that is crucial for the intergenerational structure of worldhood. Husserl continues, quote, but now it is important to put the world and birth and death, therefore generativity, seriously into essential relationship, to show to what extent this is not a mere fact, to what extent a world and people without birth and death are unthinkable. End quote. For Husserl, birth and death are essential, not accidental structures of generativity, for the generativity of personhood and of worldhood. Reading this passage in the larger context of Husserl's reflections on the uncrossable limit between generations, it would seem that the transcendental meaning of birth and death registers in me as a trace of the immemorial time of the other, thinking of Levinas here, a trace of the historicity of ancestors whose memories are never fully available to me, in a world that is nevertheless ours, having sedimented, shifted, and reconfigured itself over generations that include my own. The immemorial time of the other shows up as an uncrossable limit that institutes the historical world not solely on the basis of normalcy, harmony, and univocity, but also necessarily across discontinuous gaps and ruptures that remain irrecuperable, even as past generations exert their pressure on those who are born into any given homeworld. This collective intergenerational process of world institution complicates Husserl's account of a unified, harmonious homeworld co-constituted by normal subjects, since even the criteria for normality are and must be passed down across this synapse of the uncrossable limit between generations. These criteria are never innocent or neutral. They are charged with power, and they're repeatedly enforced through punishments and rewards, as Husserl acknowledges. And this, for me, is the most amazing passage. Think of Foucault as I read this, but this is Husserl. The child is brought up into the form of tradition, and the transgression of the form through the egoism of the individual is disapproved and punished. And the method of punishment is itself part of the form. The normal form is what one counts on, like the normal form of nature, in its environmental givenness. But it is a form from the will. We take it as natural, but it's actually normalized through willing and resisting and enforcing. And it is and should be, and it was always meant to be, and it was in the will of the fathers and the ancestors. And that belongs to their sense of what should be and will be. It should be like this now because it has always been like this, and because people lived in this norm. This norm, insofar as it has an indefinitely open horizon as a form, is determined more precisely by asking the elders as it was in such cases in the past. End quote. Norms inherited from ancestors I never met, from ancestors on the other side of this uncrossable limit between generations, are reinforced by parents and peers through punishments and rewards, disapproving frowns and encouraging smiles. My own capacity to harmonize with these norms is not entirely up to me. It depends in part on the web of power relations into which I was born, the social epistemic status of my parents and ancestors, and the degree to which they too were recognized as normal subjects or not. Even my willingness to harmonize with established norms or to rebel against them depends upon multiple factors both within and beyond my control. In any case, the formal and informal practices of punishment and reward in the homeworld into which I was born will have a profound impact on the habits, interests, and styles through which I navigate this world. But they do not form an inevitable destiny to which we have no choice but to submit. It is the life world as a whole that reproduces such punishments and rewards. Husserl's reflections on birth, death, and time resonate with the work of Hannah Arendt, who inherited the tradition of phenomenology through her teachers in 1920s Germany, including both Husserl and Heidegger, across the cataclysmic rupture of European life worlds in crisis. For Arendt, writing in 1958, quote, "We are all newcomers who are born into the world as strangers," end quote. And yet, already as anomalous newborns, we also find ourselves woven into a complex web of histories, narratives, and traditions that shape, without determining, who we will become in that world. With the concept of natality, Arendt catches sight of the extraordinary renewal of time in birth, a renewal which is made possible by the fact that we are not born to ourselves, but to a mother and into a community of others. Birth marks both the initiative or new beginning of someone new and the initiation of the self into a world where others are already there in a particular place with an established but open-ended history. In this sense, my birth is both anomalous and subject to normalization, and the world into which I am born is both extended and ruptured by my arrival. For Arendt, the plurality, or what I have been calling the anomalous diversity of human existence, is generated through birth is, quote, "the condition of human action because we are all the same, that is human, in such a way that nobody is ever the same as anyone else who ever lives, lived, or will live," end quote. Natality is a condition for action not only because it allows me to begin something new, but also because it prevents me from either finishing or escaping whatever I begin. there is always a residue or excess of action which prevents the actor from grasping their own existence as a whole. This surplus arises thanks to the diverse plurality of others who respond and interact with me, redirecting my own action along unexpected paths. Plurality renders the life world a site of incompletion, but for that very reason, a matrix of renewal, where differences emerge in the midst of the same and unforeseen futures arise from our shared relation to the past. I'm not sure to what extent Husserl would have recognized his own theory of the life world in the creative elaboration offered by Arendt some 30 years later, or in my own interpretation of his work today. But I think there's something powerful in the capacity to find inspiration for navigating a life world in crisis, in a philosophical tradition that continues transformed across multiple generations. So the last concluding section is called Navigating the Crisis. We are living through a level of the life world, not unlike the crisis that our philosophical ancestors navigated in strikingly different ways almost 100 years ago. Current attacks on diversity are not unprecedented, and they will not bring about the stability that authoritarian leaders have promised. Through a reading of Husserl's intersubjectivity manuscripts, I have argued that our life world, indeed any life world, is structured through the relation and tension between stability and diversity, normalization and anomaly. When a life world becomes too rigid, suppressing the diversity of anomalous ways of being, it risks suffocating and destroying its own capacity for renewal. When differences proliferate without adequate support, they become vulnerable to suppression and backlash. Both dimensions of the life world depend on their tension with the other to sustain themselves. Stability calls for renewal through diversity, and diversity calls for support through stability. This tension is sustained through birth, or what Arendt calls natality, a transcendental structure through which newborns arrive as anomalous strangers in a world whose history is already underway, with sedimented norms and power relations that will inevitably shape both our experience of the world and our power to co-constitute the world in life-sustaining ways. Every day we must wake up and relearn the world. This is the title of an interview with Indigenous writer Leanne Betasamosaki Simpson and Black scholar activist Robin Maynard. Translating this phrase into the phenomenological discourse I have been developing throughout this paper, the anomalous normativity of birth generates an infinite task of learning and relearning, making and remaking the life world we share together, whether we like it or not, balancing diversity and stability. The question that Simpson and Maynard posed to their interlocutors, and for which Husserl, Arendt, Butler, and Beauvoir, among others, give us a philosophical language to take up, is about what kind of life world we want to build and inhabit together, given that worlds are only possible as shared. What are the norms we want to cultivate in this shared world? How might we enact and embody these norms individually and collectively, even at a time when the normative frameworks of democratic life are under attack? In short, how do we navigate a life world in crisis, not merely by hanging on to whatever shreds of stability remain, but by acting collectively across diverse ways of being in the world to build the world we want? Thank you.
Questions?
So thank you, Professor Guenther. I think it's a very provoking reading. I have my question, but I prefer to open the microphone before and give the opportunity to others to ask. I will open the microphone, and we are streaming, so if anyone wants to send her questions, we can read on the cell phone, yes. So if anyone wants to to ask, I think it's better come to here and speak on the microphone. And please introduce yourself. Just a minute. Would you like to receive one question by one?
Hello, my name is Ricardo. Thank you, Professor Guenther, for your lecture today. It was very interesting to hear not only about Husserl, Arendt, but about our Lifeworld in crisis. It's really very important to talk about it, to discuss it. So thank you for your presentation. But my question is, throughout your speech, I couldn't help thinking about Merleau-Ponty concept of institution.
Yes.
And also because we were talking about it with Junior before your lecture. So does the concept of institution, Merleau-Ponty's concept of institution, doesn't relate with this dynamic, this relation between the beginning and the segmentation? Because I believe that with this concept, because this concept brings in it the diversity, the transformation comes from the interior, from the interior, and not from the other, the exterior. Thank you. So it's that.
Yes, so I reached back to Husserl's intersubjectivity manuscripts because I wanted to understand better the concept of Stiftung that inspired Merleau-Ponty's account of institution. And also, for me, part of this dialogue is Sartre's later Marxist existentialism in Critique of Dialectical Reason, where he theorizes the dialectical tension between praxis and the practico-inert, where praxis is human activity, not just individually understood, but collectively understood. Thank you so much, Silvana. And practico-inert is I would say, to translate this into Merleau-Ponty's terms, the instituted sedimentation of praxis, not just in the world, but as a world. And so the world is made through human praxis. And I think in many ways, Merleau-Ponty's account of institution is far more radical than Husserl's. So he sees this as a process that is not just about how a science is established, and then through repetition, the durable structures are formed, and through writing, these discoveries are passed down from generation to generation. I think this is the context within which the concept of Stiftung is sort of takes root for Husserl. But Merleau-Ponty reads these writings, both published and unpublished, by Husserl, and given his own grounding in an incredible understanding of biological processes as well as social processes. Merleau-Ponty sees institution as happening at the level of organic life, at the level of infant development, physical and emotional and intellectual, at the level of the family, at the level of the built environment, at every level. So I'm working on a book right now about what I understand as the institution, or the establishment and reproduction of a life world grounded in colonialism, capitalism, and incarceration. And I haven't yet completely decided whether I agree with Merleau-Ponty that the possibilities for instituting the world otherwise are already immanent within the world. As you say, they're interior, they're not exterior. It's a matter of reactivating and affirming and elaborating possibilities that are already here in the transcendental historical field in which we find ourselves. And I think there are ways of reading. I've learned from Smaranda Aldea's work on Besinnung in Husserl about the way that Husserl himself is thinking of the transcendental field as historical as well, and as open to reactivation and reorientation. So all of that I find very compelling. But then there's something in Sartre's account of praxis and the practico-inert and the requirement not just to reactivate immanent possibilities, but to fight. So Sartre, in his reading of Marx, reorients, or he takes this concept in the direction of dialectical action, revolutionary action, and he develops a whole social ontology of the group that emerges initially through just a serial connection, and then through some sort of conflict forms a groupe en fusion that then is also opposed to others, and that fights, purges its own dissension within its group, and through political struggle creates the world. So what is the logic of world building? Is it the logic of a complex field within which there are always these immanent generative possibilities, and it's a matter of picking out the possibilities we want to repeat and turn into durable structures? I think this is Merleau-Ponty's perspective. But this is why Sartre was frustrated with him politically, I think. Because Sartre is like, no, we must fight. We must fight us against them. We have to defeat them. And to be honest, my own personality is more like, no, let's pick out latent possibilities and affirm them. But I also see the importance of dialectical struggle and appreciate the impact that it has, especially when in a world in crisis, life world in crisis.
One more question. I will translate some. It's not a question. It's just a comment. From Eric Inácio Escamelot. He says that he congratulates you and for your presentation or reflection. That is very good. And he says that this phrase, what are the norms we want to cultivate in shared world, is very good, and the touched him.
Oh, that's lovely. Thank you.
And Simone had
Simone. I have to try to because I think it is in a moment that she was doing her lecture. In advance of the text, you take you retreat the I don't know if you want the rigid.
You improve the complexity of the idea of normality. She's Simone. Simone. She's a Foucauldian thinker. So yes. The idea of normality is important to her. So she's.
It's not too rigid.
It's not so rigid, so fixed.
Yes, exactly.
Because the conception of Foucault is more rigid than that you presented today of normality. Because everybody's normal in a sense. You could talk about that, the difference and the idea of normality in Foucault and in Husserl, or in a phenomenological perspective?
Yes, yes. Thank you for that question and comment. So this is something that I think a year ago or so, when I started reading these manuscripts in German and very laboriously working through and translating and tearing my hair out, I didn't think that I was writing about normality. I thought I would write about, I wanted to learn more about Stiftung and the Lifeworld and this homeworld, alien world relationship. But normality and normalization kept coming up, and I was frustrated by it. And I had a Foucauldian suspicion of the normal. And my initial reading of these texts was a kind of Foucauldian critique of this disciplinary power that I saw in Husserl to say, everyone must be normal. And the problem is when people are not normal, and we have to make them normal. So let's solve that problem. And I was like, no, that's not the problem. The problem is normalization. And then every time I go like this, but really every time I looked on my phone at the news, my reaction would be, you can't do that. That's not normal. You can't say, a president cannot say, we're going to get rid of the border between our country and yours and annex Canada. They can't, you cannot starve a people and bomb them and say that they're the problem. None of this is normal. And I was listening to myself and I started to appreciate what I think it might be a correct interpretation, might be an incorrect interpretation, but where Husserl might have been coming from, writing in the 1920s and the 1930s, and living through a time when his own status as a Jew who converted to Protestant Christianity, his own status as a renowned professor of phenomenology, was being overturned and contested and canceled out by the National Socialist movement, and where his world was crumbling and shaken to the core. And he died before he could see the complete unfolding of that. But this brought back to me a kind of appreciation for what I argue for in this essay, which is some sort of balance between a critique of those power relations through which norms are enforced, and punishments and forms of disciplinary power and exclusion and inclusion all conspire to homogenize and control subject formation. We still need to pay attention to that as a critical set of questions. But I also thought there is something important about stability. And actually, Alexis Shotwell has a great paper called Open Normativities, about the need within anarchist and feminist communities for norms, established and amplified norms of caring for one another, treating each other well. These are norms we want. If we want to build a world that is not founded on domination, we need to think about and create ways that we want to relate to one another. And that is that's a conversation about what are the norms we want to uphold. And it raises questions about the power relations through which we hold each other accountable to conduct ourselves according to these norms. It raises all kinds of tricky questions for movements that desire to create another world, a more liberatory world. How do we treat each other in that world? This is a question of norms. And how do we do this in a way that is intergenerational, that unfolds not just for an anarchist collective of 3 people, but actually can, this is where institution comes up again, can institute ways of being that become a new normal. Not merely in a coercive way, but in a way that, you know, how do we build the world that we want? One of the ways is through instituting, repeating, establishing the norms of treating each other, responding to one another, caring for one another that we want. So that's, I think this is, it's maybe less about the tension between Foucault's account of norms and normality and Husserl's account of norms and normality. There's a third term in there that is, what can feminists learn from both Foucault and Husserl and others about both the dangers of norms, the coercive power of normalization, and also the need for feminist norms. Feminist norms of paying attention to precisely the ways that gender and sexuality are reduced to something that they are not, or deployed in ways to control women and differently gendered people, and so on and so on. And so what are the epistemic norms, the ethical norms, the political norms that we need to build a world that is robustly feminist and that does not use feminism as an alibi to police the proliferation of different genders, for example.
Thank you.
I have more 3 questions here. Would you like to ask? No? So I think I will read this one. This is from Tiago Dias. He has been with us at the workshop. I wonder how Arendt's amor mundi, love, care for the world, would relate to this normalization. Is taking care of the normalization a kind of care for the world? Choosing better normalization as a term would somehow be a care of the life world?
Yes. So it's both about the content of those norms and also the ways we affirm those norms. So I think it's a question of both, what are the norms we want? What are norms that embody what Ariella Azoulay, reading Arendt, calls world carefulness? But it's really about, that embody this amor mundi, a care and a love for the world. But also, how do we share these norms with others and even hold ourselves accountable to these norms in a way that does not rely upon coercive forms of enforcement? Is this even possible? This question comes up all the time. So I was very, not really surprised, but somewhat surprised by my reaction to Bolsonaro's conviction, because I am a prison abolitionist. I do not believe that prisons solve problems. I think that they are used as colonial forms, racist forms, capitalist forms of domination. And yet I was so happy that he was convicted. So is this a contradiction? Yeah. Is this, we will enforce our norms of democratic respect on you by punishing you? Or is this a way of, in some ways, an abolitionist use of the current criminal legal system to punish those that it was not intended to punish, to punch up rather than punch down? So I think some people make abolitionist arguments for using apparatuses of power like the courts to hold the powerful accountable, because it kind of explodes the very logic of the prison system. But is that the kind of amor mundi that we want to cultivate? Maybe amor mundi takes different forms in different contexts, and there's no one simple or pure way that democratic norms, norms of mutual care, norms of world carefulness can be shared or enforced even on those who blatantly and deliberately violate them. So this is a big question for me, I think, for a lot of people. What we might have the most wonderful, caring, respectful norms in the world, and then what happens when someone violates them? Ideally, it's a restorative practice where we have a conversation and reinforce through care that it's not okay to treat other people in this way. But what happens when someone really, with great impunity, just violates these norms of mutual care? If people have an answer to that, I would love to hear.
Well, I have just one question, not answer. One question. I think it's close to last one, because this is from Victor, and he has been with us
From Tuesday, yes.
On Tuesday. And Tiago Dias and Victor studies Hannah Arendt, so but this question is a little long.
Okay.
Every day we must wake up and relearn the world, he quoted. So this phrase brought some questions to me. Having to learn the world anew every day is very interesting, of course, when took as a metaphor. Literally, it would be very tiresome.
Yes.
Hannah Arendt articulates this need of a sort of immediate adjustment to the established reality of the world shared with others, with the concept of common sense, which is, so to speak, both an inheritance from tradition and some sort of Weltgeist, I think it is in German. Yeah. And some sort of Weltgeist constantly transformed by action, both of sole individuals in a minor scale and collective groups, but also of power structures like governments and economical actors, companies, new conglomerates, etc. The point is that no one can wake up every day as if she was a newborn. Our experiences, our judgments, and preconceptions, prejudices, and this common sense give us a basic stability to dwell in the world. That's one of the more insightful concepts in Arendt's framework, in my opinion, his opinion. And it seems very in line with one of the threads that seem to conduct our presentation. Yeah. So now the question. What is safety in a world permeated by a hegemonic common sense where killing the so-called abnormal, trans, queer woman and genociding the surpluses, indigenous and blacks on the Americas, Palestinians and Arabs, is accepted and even enforced? So what is safety in this world? And how to actually construct a world where we have not to literally wake up and relearn how to inhabit a world that wants to kills us, but be it to camouflage and be discrete. I'm thinking on Butler's description of discrete gender performances that can be translated beyond gender, be it to actively resist against it.
Yeah. Oh, what a great question and a great elaboration of the question. Thank you for that. So maybe I'll just begin by putting the phrase into context. So it's Leanne Simpson and Robin Maynard who were interviewed, and I think it's actually Robin Maynard who says, every day we must wake up and remake the world, but I can't remember. It arises in conversation between the two of them in any case. And the interview was leading up to the publication of a book that is an exchange of letters between them called Rehearsals for Living. And it is a set of conversations between an Indigenous woman and a Black woman, both of whom are committed to decolonization and prison abolition, who are raising children in a world that is designed to destroy them. And so the phrase, every day we must wake up and remake the world, comes out of that context of Indigenous, Black and Indigenous survival. And so within that context, that work of everyday remaking the world is both exhausting and impossible and also necessary every day. If I understand their perspective correctly. And that is because common sense is organized around, even when it accommodates Blackness and indigeneity, it's organized around the exclusion and demotion of indigeneity and Blackness. So then the question arises, is it possible, this is sort of connected to the previous question, is it possible to institute and sustain and support forms of common sense that are not grounded on the supremacy of whiteness or colonialism or patriarchy, that are generative and supportive forms of common sense? And that's, I think, what Arendt, with her own concerns, which are, she's coming from a different place here, and even Husserl with his own emphasis on stability and the importance of shared traditions, raises this possibility of thinking through norms in a complicated way that affirms that we need norms of common sense. We need those norms of common sense not to be built on in a way that makes some people live and lets others die, that are not organized biopolitically, that are not organized around that racist cut we were talking about on Tuesday. And then the question is how we do that. And I'm thinking now, just connecting your question to the previous question and my concerns about how do we reproduce and enforce more mutually caring and even liberatory norms, or is that a contradiction in terms? I was thinking about Arendt's own position on Eichmann, and her final statement that because Eichmann refused to share the world with Jews, it is both just and good to refuse to share the world with him, that in this instance, the death penalty is warranted. And that couldn't have been an easy process for her to go through the entire trial to come to this conclusion. But it is, I think it raises this question about how do we stabilize and hold forms of common sense that do not tolerate the destruction of some lives for the sake of the improvement of others, and that also do not use the tools of the master to try to dismantle the master's house. Yeah, I feel like the word chiasm came up earlier. That's the chiasm that I find myself sort of swirling back and forth in, that we need new forms of common sense. And is it possible to transmit and to share and to enforce even this common sense without engaging in some form of coercion and even violence? So, again, an open question.
I just read Tiago Diaz's comment,
Okay, sure.
the last one.
Yes.
Question. That form of thinking, the care of the world, made me think of Cavareiro's ethics of inclinations against the ethics
Yes.
of Homo erectus, as a feminist form of relate to the other, especially the vulnerable. And I will do my question, and after I come back. But I'm going to another direction.
Okay, great.
So when I've read your presentation, because I have had access before, I thought it was very provoking, your thought provoking, because I used to read the tempted to escape of the Husserl's solipsism by defending the empathy, and it is not your path.
Right.
And the empathy unfolds with Edith Stein's work, but I think I will read my own question, because it's better. However, you argue that to a certain degree, one has access to the memory of the other through empathy.
Mm-hmm.
And I think precisely because it's not an original perception, the way in which otherness is revealed in Husserl's philosophy, as I've understood it here, would be by an interruption or a gap, you said, more than the no original limit, but through this uncrossable limit that birth and death promote.
Yeah.
And even Husserl compared the certainty of every other existence to the experience of the memory of the human past. And the emphasis in your conference, in your lecture, seems to me to give to this gap an important element for the constitution of the world as intergenerational. Mm-hmm. This gap allows an opening to the other and open also to the immemorial history, which is essential to renewal, alterity, new beginnings, and births. I won't do a question. I won't ask you about time, but it's always about time at the memorial. But I promise that I will ask you a general question, not as the last one. So this open came from a surplus which I follow. The Hida is an indicative sign, and your interpretation points out to the diversity, a difference in relation to the other that couldn't be grasped because of intrinsic anomaly. And by choosing this gap, I see you very close to the Hida, for example, when in the Origin of Geometry, when he defends that there is how can I say? It's necessary to pose. Even when you need to think in a history of the science or the geometry in this case, the scholars, the thinkers need to pose. And this gap could be, I need to have lunch, or the intergenerational gap.
Yeah.
No? But to reactivate and search for the origin of the science. So, but my question is more general, because I'd like to understand how you think the difference between critical phenomenology and deconstruction when they are very close.
Yes.
And given what I said, what was the place of the empathy in the Husserl's in this kind of Husserl's reading? Because I was listening to you again today, and even the normality of the femininity, it's not access for it's not the woman or the feminine is not normal, even from the empathy.
I love this question, and it also, I think, connects really to your question from Tuesday. And I'm thinking about that. So earlier we had a workshop and we read a few articles that I had written, and Mariana had a great question about Cavarero's concept of the maternal sequence. And it was a very complex question, but one part of that question that really stayed with me is, how does one affirm the intergenerational, the ontological importance of birth and of this intergenerational time that birth implies, without, for example, enforcing a norm that women must give birth because this is a miracle and we are, properly biologically set up to perform that miracle, and therefore, because we can, we must. But your question was really about time and about sequencing. And readers of Cavarero might want to press me on this, but for me, the notion of a maternal sequence and the continuity that Cavarero emphasizes, in my view, in that sequence, covers over this discontinuity that Husserl and I think Levinas and Derrida point to in the lack of seamless continuity between generations. And so Husserl's attention to this immemorial gap between generations reminds me of the lapse of time that Levinas sees in the relation between, for example, the father and the son, or even between the anarchic temporality of the maternal body in relation to the other, who both is, to whom she's infinitely responsible, but who also disembowels her and tears her own coherent identity apart. And so there might be a way of bringing, we already have a lot on the page here, but I feel like Derrida's Violence and Metaphysics and his reading of Husserl and Levinas is relevant here, because Derrida really sides with Husserl against Levinas, saying Levinas has too stark an account of alterity, of the other as absolutely other. And the brilliance of Husserl's account of empathy is that the other can only, he acknowledges the other can only show up as different from me within the sphere of ownness, from my perspective, where they are a phenomenon, and to bring in the insights from the intersubjectivity manuscripts, where I am ultimately the judge for myself of whether this person is normal or abnormal according to the norms established in me. So is there a way that Husserl is both acknowledging the gap, the temporal gap between generations that I think Levinas so brilliantly identifies, and yet also giving us a way, a phenomenological language for talking about the ambiguity of both continuity and discontinuity, of overlapping and distinction, divergence of generations, of self and other. That it's precisely his return again and again to the normal and normalization that gives us a language for more robustly affirming the inevitability of anomaly as it arises both between generations, and in that way is temporalizing and historicizing, but also anomaly as it arises within lived experience, the lived experience of another, as it arises within the experience of empathy. So that empathy is not simply just an assimilation of the other as similar to me, but is whether I like it or not, always an experience of the anomalous difference of the other in the midst of my grasping of them as more or less normal compared to myself. Yeah, so maybe there's a kind of ghost of Derrida's generative reading of Husserl in this, that runs through also this account of intergenerational time in Husserl. Much more to think about there, but I like the way that the discontinuity of generations gives us a way of rethinking the maternal sequence, not simply as woman, 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 you know, a chain of women all holding hands. That's not a very fair, it's not the fairest interpretation of the maternal sequence, but if we want to affirm, along with Cavarero, a kind of a maternal sequence, we ought to also affirm this discontinuity of intergenerational time, that is generative, and that allows for the anomalous divergences through which a life world is created and sustained. I don't know if that somehow gives us some insight into the question of enforcement of more world-careful forms of common sense. Victor's question and Tiago's question. Because it may, I'm trailing off here because my mind is going in multiple directions at once, but I feel like there's some sort of insight into the difficulty, the challenge of sustaining world-careful practices across generations. That we can design and imagine a utopian world as leftists, as anarchists, as abolitionists, as feminists, from whatever position, you know, liberatory movement you want to imagine. But if a design is not the same as the living embodiment, which will always involve divergences and unexpected anomalies, and somehow to build and sustain a life world that is grounded in decolonial feminist forms of common sense has to grapple with the inevitability of anomaly, even as much as more conventional, conservative visions of the world we want. So enforcement, or perhaps we need to think of just, how do you achieve the continuity of a life world that is transcendentally constituted by discontinuity? That discontinuity is amazing and beautiful when it opens up alternative possibilities to authoritarian, patriarchal life worlds. It's also frustrating and gut-wrenching when it proliferates divergences from world-careful feminist norms. When we see that a life world in which certain things that we thought were established, like reproductive rights, are once again put into question. But I think what these questions teach us is that life worlds are unruly and also patterned webs of relation, and they cannot be otherwise. Anyway, I went down a little bit of a path there. But.
Thank you.
No, I think it's okay. So it was so beautiful and so important to us, this meeting today. And I think, Lisa, both the workshop and the conference of today, I think they were only the birth of conversation. And we are very happy. We learned a lot with you. And I think this new perspective to phenomenology is great, is vivant. And I'd like to continue this conversation with you and with my students. So thank you very much for this moment, so deep of reflecting. And I'd like to invite you again to the next week to our colloquium on archives. And that's it. Thank you, Mariana. Would you like to say something? Lisa, would you like to say something?
Only
Anything
thank you.
else? Only thing. So that's it. Thank you for the questions, and that's it.